"Excuse me, miss," the flight attendant said, her tone cool and dismissive. "First class is for paying customers." Amara blinked, stunned. She glanced at her ticket, then back at the attendant. "I am a first-class passenger," Amara replied, her voice steady. The attendant's eyes narrowed. "There's been a mistake. You don't belong here. If you don't step aside, I'll call security." The crowd began to whisper. What the attendant didn't know was that Amara wasn't just any passenger. She was the daughter of the airline's owner. And now, the very woman who tried to humiliate her was about to pay the price. Hit subscribe if you believe no one should ever be judged this way. Stay tuned. This story is far from over. The international airport hums with a familiar rhythm. Passengers weaving between security lines, children clutching stuffed animals, businessmen tapping on their phones. Overhead announcements echo across the terminal, directing travelers to their gates. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifts from a nearby cafe, blending with the distant scent of jet fuel. Amara Lewis moves through the crowd with quiet confidence, her steps measured, her posture poised. Her outfit is simple yet elegant, reflecting her father's belief that grace speaks louder than excess. The occasional glance from passers-by doesn't faze her. She is used to the curiosity, the unspoken questions behind polite smiles. Beside her, Maria keeps pace, her presence both reassuring and protective. Years of watching Amara navigate spaces like these have made her attuned to the subtle shifts in atmosphere, the moments when admiration turns into scrutiny. Ahead, the first-class boarding line gleams under the bright terminal lights. The polished counters and velvet ropes separate those who belong from those who don't. For Amara, it is more than a routine checkpoint. It is a silent test, a place where perceptions are challenged before tickets are scanned. She approaches with practiced ease, ticket in hand, her fingers grazing its smooth surface. The line moves steadily, each passenger stepping forward without hesitation. Then, Susan Reynolds notices her. The flight attendant's gaze lingers a moment too long, her expression unreadable yet heavy with assumption. There is no welcoming nod, no brief glance at the boarding pass, just a sharp, assessing stare. The moment stretches, an unspoken judgment forming before a word is exchanged. When Amara reaches the counter, she hands over her ticket with the same effortless confidence she's carried her whole life. The expected nod of approval never comes. Instead, Susan steps in front of her, body rigid, blocking her path. The words fall from her lips smoothly, as though rehearsed. A direction rather than a question. A dismissal rather than an inquiry. For a split second, Amara hesitates. The phrase hangs in the air, absurd in its certainty. She blinks, recalibrating, searching for context where there is none. Maria shifts beside her, the smallest movement, but one that carries weight. Amara straightens, her grip tightening on the ticket, a silent push against the doubt creeping in. She extends it again, careful to keep her voice steady, unshaken. The rejection comes swiftly, a scoff laced with finality. A decision already made. The words are louder now, calculated for effect. Heads turn, eyes linger. Conversations stall as attention shifts toward the unfolding scene. A businessman exhales audibly, shaking his head. A woman leans toward her companion, murmuring something indistinct yet clear in its meaning. Maria takes a step forward, her voice level but firm. The challenge is simple. A request, not a confrontation. The response is immediate, arms crossing, stance tightening. Resistance, unwavering and absolute. A dull, familiar burn spreads in Amara's chest. The kind that comes not from anger, but exhaustion. The weight of expectation presses against her. The unspoken demand that she prove herself, justify her presence, remind them that she belongs. The terminal noise fades into a distant hum, replaced by the rush of her own thoughts. She can feel the moment tipping, the balance between restraint and defiance shifting with each passing second. The voices around her blur, some passive, some complicit, all reinforcing a truth she has long understood. She exhales slowly, willing the tension from her shoulders. Her father's words resurface, steady as ever. The pressure builds, a silent battle between instinct and expectation. She refuses to give them what they want. Blinking once, she swallows the sting, keeping her expression unreadable. This moment is no longer about a seat. It never was. The air tightens around her, thick with anticipation. The pause before impact. And then, everything changes. Amara had never known a life without luxury, but she had also never known a life without judgment. The grand homes, the private schools, the exclusive clubs, none of it shielded her from the unspoken message that she was an exception, not the expectation. Her father, Jonathan Lewis, built Phoenix Air from the ground up, proving that success wasn't a privilege reserved for the few, but a fight won by the determined. People respected his name. They respected his power. But that respect rarely extended to her. She had seen it too many times. The pause, the questioning glance, the flicker of doubt before recognition set in. The realization that she wasn't just any black girl, but Jonathan Lewis's daughter. It was a shield, but a fragile one. She learned early on that being exceptional wasn't enough. It never was. In school, it was the same story. Teachers assumed she needed extra help, that her presence in advanced courses was a mistake. A teacher once pulled her aside, suggesting she transfer to an easier class, until they saw her last name. Then came the backtracking, the forced smile, the sudden shift from doubt to praise. She remembered the stares when she arrived at charity galas with her father. The polite smiles from guests who quickly searched for a connection that would justify why she was there. The way their curiosity faded once they realized her lineage. People always saw her race before her accomplishments. And no matter how many times it happened, it always felt the same. No matter how polite she was, no matter how well-dressed or well-spoken, the question always lingered. Does she belong? Every room, every conversation, every handshake felt like a test. Would they respect her for who she was, or only for the name she carried? Her father had always told her, "People will judge, but you define who you are." It was a comforting thought, but standing at the airport gate, humiliation burning in her chest, those words felt far away. Her boarding pass was still in her hand, fingers tightening around it, as if it was the only proof she had of her place. Susan's eyes were unwavering, her lips pressed into a thin, immovable line. Amara felt exposed, like every person at the gate had stopped to watch. She wasn't just a girl boarding a plane anymore. She was a spectacle. Her chest tightened. Heat crawled up her neck. She forced herself to swallow it down. Susan's voice was clipped, final. Her pulse pounded in her ears. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some looked away, pretending they hadn't heard. Others shifted uncomfortably. Amara felt the weight of their judgment, heavier than the suitcase by her side. Her heart pounded. Her hands trembled. She clenched her fists at her sides, fighting the war between anger and restraint. Susan reached for her radio. Passengers exchanged glances. A few whispered. A businessman frowned and checked his watch, clearly impatient. Amara's breath came faster now. A sharp laugh cut through the air. A teenage boy, lounging in a first-class seat, smirked at his friend. The words hit harder than she expected. She stared down at the floor, the bile rising in her throat. She wanted to say something, to yell, to fight, but she knew how this worked. If she reacted, she would be the problem. Not Susan. Not the boy. Her. The murmurs grew. Each whisper was another wound, another reminder. Another cut. Her hands curled into fists, nails digging into her palms. Her throat burned. The weight of every past experience, every doubting glance, every dismissal pressed down on her. She had spent her whole life holding it in, but now it was crushing her. Then a sound, a throat clearing. An elderly black woman, seated in first class, adjusted her glasses and set down her book. Susan hesitated. Passengers turned to look. Susan exhaled sharply, snatching the manifest from the counter. Her eyes skimmed the list. Then they stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Her face paled. She swallowed, lips parting slightly as though searching for words. The room seemed to hold its breath. Passengers waited, watching, but the damage had already been done. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the unspoken reality of what was happening. Susan stood behind the counter, eyes narrowed, posture rigid. She refused to look away from Amara, Her gaze locked on the young girl standing in front of her. Despite the crowded airport, the rest of the world seemed to fade away, all attention focusing on the standoff. Amara, still holding her boarding pass, remained silent. Her fingers clutched it tightly, her knuckles turning white. She had been here countless times before, but never had it felt like this. Never had she felt like she didn't belong. "Excuse me, this is my seat," Amara said, her voice soft but steady. Susan did not flinch, her eyes scanning the pass with deliberate slowness. She flicked her eyes over Amara once more, a small, almost imperceptible sneer curling at the corners of her lips. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," Susan replied, her tone dripping with condescension. "First class is for paying customers. Economy is that way." Amara's breath caught in her throat. Her face flushed with the sting of humiliation, but she forced herself to stay composed. She had dealt with this kind of treatment her whole life. It wasn't new. It wasn't right. But it wasn't new. Maria, standing beside Amara, shifted uncomfortably, her hand moving to rest gently on Amara's arm. A protective gesture. But Amara could feel the weight of the eyes now watching them, judging them. "Please check again." "There's been a mistake," Amara said, keeping her voice even. But Susan only shook her head, not even bothering to look at the boarding pass again. She reached for her radio instead, her fingers moving with a practiced ease that sent a chill down Amara's spine. The murmurs from the surrounding passengers grew louder. Some were sympathetic, glancing awkwardly at Amara. Others just plain indifferent, unsure of how to respond to the situation. A businessman in the corner sighed audibly. One voice, though, cut through the noise. A teenage boy, lounging lazily in a first-class seat, chuckled quietly to his friend. "I knew she didn't belong here." His words were soft, but carried just enough disdain to make Amara's stomach churn. Her hands clenched into fists, her nails biting into her palms. She wanted to snap, to scream, to show them all who she was. But she couldn't. She'd learned too many times before that to do so would only prove their point, that she was the problem. Maria's voice was low, a note of concern in it. "Don't let them see you break." Amara didn't respond. Her throat tightened, but she swallowed the emotions that threatened to spill over. She was better than this. Susan's voice came again, cutting through the silence. "I've already called security. You'll need to step aside until they arrive." Amara stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't just about this flight. It was everything. Every moment where she had to fight for her seat at the table, fight for the right to simply exist without being doubted. She closed her eyes, her father's words echoing in her mind. "People will judge, but you define who you are." The voice of an elderly woman rose above the growing tension. "Why don't you check the list again?" The woman's voice was steady, her tone unwavering. She locked eyes with Susan, an unspoken challenge hanging in the air. For a moment, Susan hesitated. The radio in her hand faltered slightly. She glanced at the manifest, clearly reluctant to do anything that might contradict her authority. But then, with a sharp breath, she snatched it from the counter and scanned the names. Amara's name appeared in bold letters on the list. Susan's face drained of color. The murmurs around her grew quieter. Passengers began to whisper to one another, the realization of what had just transpired settling in like a heavy weight. And then, just as Amara thought she might suffocate under the scrutiny, a new presence entered the scene. Jonathan Lewis walked into the gate area, his tailored suit commanding attention. His every step seemed to part the crowd, and a hushed silence fell as the passengers recognized him. There was no mistaking who he was. "Is there a problem with my daughter's boarding?" Jonathan's voice was calm, but it carried a weight of authority that silenced the room. Susan's eyes flickered to him, and the color drained from her face. She stammered, her words a jumble of half-formed excuses. I was just doing my job, sir." Jonathan's gaze remained unwavering, fixed on her with a quiet intensity. "What's the company policy on discrimination?" His voice was sharp, leaving no room for argument. The manager, who had been standing quietly off to the side, stepped forward. We don't tolerate that, sir. It's just that." Jonathan's eyes didn't leave Susan's, a quiet judgment settling in the space between them. "It's simple," he said. "You've made a mistake. And now, You'll have to face the consequences. Susan's knees trembled as Jonathan's words sank in. He looked at her one final time, his expression unreadable. Consider this your last flight under Phoenix Air, Jonathan said, his tone calm but final. The room was still. Everyone watched as the reality of Jonathan's words took root in Susan. Her face flushed with embarrassment. She opened her mouth, but no words came. She was finished. Security arrived shortly after, escorting Susan away from the gate. Her face was red, her pride shattered, as she walked past Amara without a word. The passengers who had once watched the scene unfold with passive interest now found themselves silently processing the moment. Some exchanged looks, others avoided eye contact altogether. Amara felt the weight of the moment settle over her. Her heart still raced, but there was a quiet strength in her now, an understanding that she had won, not through force, but through standing her ground. She turned to her father, who placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. She nodded, the weight of the world suddenly seeming just a little bit lighter. Amara settled into her first-class seat, the plush leather pressing against her back. For a moment, she closed her eyes, attempting to breathe in the comfort and luxury that had always surrounded her. But today it felt hollow. The weight of the moment was still heavy in her chest, the sting of injustice gnawing at her. The usual calm of first class, the quiet, the refined air, felt like a distant dream, out of reach beneath the surface of the day's events. The other passengers were already settling in, their conversations quiet but present. A few glanced in her direction, some out of curiosity, others with a sense of quiet respect. But Amara could feel the shift, the energy that still lingered from the confrontation at the gate. It wasn't just about the seat she had fought for. It was about every moment of her life where she had been made to feel like she didn't truly belong. Her fingers tightened around the armrest. She tried to distract herself by gazing out the window, but the images outside felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else. How many times, she thought, how many times had she been judged before she even opened her mouth? She replayed the scene in her mind, the frustration, the disbelief, the anger. Susan's condescending tone, the disbelief that someone like her could belong in first class. It was all so familiar, yet so exhausting. Amara realized then, perhaps for the first time, that her silence had never protected her. It never could, but her words, her voice, had done something today. They had changed the narrative. Amara took a deep breath, reaching for her phone in her bag. She scrolled through her messages absently before stopping at the blank text box. Her thumb hovered above the keyboard. She hesitated. What should she say? Should she share this moment? Was it worth the risk? She remembered her father's words. People will judge, but you define who you are. She wasn't going to stay silent anymore. Not today. Not after everything. Amara began to type. Not with anger, but with purpose. Her fingers moved slowly at first, then faster as the words began to form. Today, I boarded my flight with a first-class ticket. I was stopped and questioned by a flight attendant, not because of anything I did, but because of who I am. I am a black girl in a world that doesn't always believe I belong. This happens every day. Today I had power. Many don't. She paused, reading over the words. It wasn't a rant. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement, a truth that so many people of color could understand, and so many people who had never been forced to confront it needed to hear. She hit post and felt a strange shift inside herself. There was no fear anymore, only resolve. The post quickly caught fire, just as she had expected. Her notifications flooded with likes, shares, and comments. Messages from friends, acquaintances, and even strangers poured in, many with stories of their own. Stories of being questioned, doubted, rejected, all because of the color of their skin. Black travelers, one after another, shared their experiences of similar biases in high-end spaces, restaurants, stores, hotels, even airplanes. They talked about being dismissed, disregarded, and judged simply for existing. Amara felt something else take root in her, the recognition that her voice mattered, and it was making a difference. The post went viral within hours. Influencers, activists, public figures shared it, amplifying the conversation. Hashtags exploded, and news outlets began picking up the story. The conversation wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been treated unfairly, quietly pushed aside by a society that too often favored the privileged. The hashtag belong here trended worldwide. Amara's father, Jonathan Lewis, was quick to speak out. But instead of focusing solely on defending his daughter, he spoke to the larger issue. "This is not just about my daughter," he said in a live broadcast, standing beside her. "This is about every person who has ever been judged before they were heard. It's time to change that. It's time to make this a place where everyone truly belongs." The executives at Phoenix Air scrambled to respond. They could no longer ignore the systemic issue that had been exposed. The story, sparked by a single moment of prejudice, was now a national conversation. The airline couldn't hide from it any longer. And Amara, standing beside her father, felt a sense of clarity for the first time in years. She had never known exactly where she fit in the family business. She had always been in her father's shadow, unsure of her role. But now it was clear. She was a part of this change. "I want to be part of this," Amara told Jonathan later that night, her voice steady. "I want to make a difference. I don't just want to inherit this company. I want to use it for something bigger." Jonathan looked at her, pride filling his eyes. "You already have, sweetheart." As the plane ascended, Amara gazed out at the clouds, watching them drift beneath her, feeling the weight in her chest lift. "I belong," she whispered to herself. "And I always will." The sky seemed to stretch endlessly in front of her, a symbol of her journey, her strength, and the limitless possibilities ahead.